The chairman, I think I hear votes. I think I heard the chairman say that under the bill that is being presented, that he wanted to give the ability of the regulators to some extent decide which creditors receive payments, partial, whole, the timing. Is that my understanding from the chairman? I would have us look at the Chrysler and GM restructurings, which were highly unprecedented. We know that the administration leveraged TARP funds. Ultimately, it was a plan, I admit, approved by a bankruptcy court, but I think there are a couple of lessons to be learned here. Number one, we know that under the terms of the Chrysler agreement, senior secured creditors received 29 cents on the dollar. The UAW pension fund, the United Auto Workers, an unsecured creditor, received 43 cents on the dollar and a 55% equity stake in quote-unquote new Chrysler. So that's interesting. Under GM, the bondholders were asked to swap $27 billion in debt for up to a 10 to 25% common equity interest. The UAW agreed to swap less, $20 billion, for more, 17.5% to 20%, and $9 billion in preferred stock and notes from GM. So I guess my concern would be this. Once we have this entity that has this bailout fund, could it be used in a fashion that, again, that ultimately does very little to promote financial stability, but might promote another political agenda, a social agenda, some other economic agenda? I have some concerns, again, with the creation of the fund. I understand the chairman intends to limit it to $200 billion. I would hope that that's still seen as a significant sum in this town. I understand it is not the purpose of the intent of the chairman to have taxpayer funds used, but again, as history is my guide, we would have to suspend disbelief, I think, in order to believe that ultimately taxpayer funds may not be called upon. And I think the regulators would have the tendency, if in doubt, do the bailout. It's not their money, it's somebody else's money. So I think number one, you create a system and an incentive to have further bailouts. Regardless of whether you have a list or not, you still have the implicit Fannie-Freddie problem. And now you have the possibility that the fund could be politicized, as many of us believe, as it was in the GM and the Chrysler case, to essentially have the federal government pick winners and losers in contravention of decades and decades of accepted bankruptcy practice that can, again, particularly at this critical time in our nation's economy, hamper our economic recovery by making people less interested in risking capital when they think that ultimately their position in any kind of reorganization could simply be undone by what ultimately would be a political entity. And so again, I guess my conclusion would be this. Number one, when our friends on the other side of the aisle say, well, we're looking for the death penalty. I guess there's death penalties, and then there's cryogenics. You know, we got rid of old GM, and the next day we had new GM. We had old Chrysler, and then we had new Chrysler, and somehow the political allies of the administration ended up getting rewarded. Creditors who had received TARP funds, all of a sudden they came to heel. They were on a tight leash. And to me, again, it just goes to the basis of two different approaches. If you create a bailout fund, if you build it, they will come. It's that simple. And the big differences that we hear when people say, well, we want the death penalty, what we're trying to do is you think that ultimately the great sin was that these major financial firms went belly up. We believe the big problem is that they receive taxpayer bailouts and they create more moral hazard and greater risk going forward. And so whatever remaining time is left, I would just ask the chairman then Is there anything in the legislation that would prevent the committee or the council from essentially doing what we saw was done in the GM and the Chrysler cases? And I would ask the gentleman from Minnesota if he'd be willing to yield time to the chairman to answer that question.
Go to the chairman.